Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Pavla Niklova, and I'm on the board of the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews, who's the organizer of tonight's event. It's the first in-person gathering for us after 2 years, so it is wonderful. Thank you so much for coming. We have wonderful panelists here from all over the world. We are absolutely excited. I'd like to say good evening also to everyone who's watching us on YouTube. We are live, and the program also will stay there, so people will be able to watch it later. I'd like to thank our partners, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic, Leo Baeck Institute, Harriman Institute, Columbia University, Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association, and also Consulate General of the Czech Republic. And we have the pleasure to welcome Lucie Hendelsová, the Vice Consul, who would like to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Paula, and good evening, everyone. I'm really honored to be here and welcome you in the Bohemia National Hall on behalf of the Consulate General of the Czech Republic in New York. And first, please let me thank the organizers, the Bohemian Benevolent and Literary Association, and also the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews for putting this event together. We are really honored to have such distinguished guests here with us tonight. Just to briefly open the panel, I'd like to say a few words. Well, the Jewish presence in the Czech lands has a very long history, and Jews of Bohemia and Moravia formed one of the most important and vibrant communities in Europe. This was especially made possible by, I'd say, relatively low levels of anti-Semitism within the Czech population within the last few hundred years. And I'm quite proud to say that this is still true today. Before the Second World War, the Jewish population was strongly integrated within the Czech society, and as such became an important part of the rich social and cultural mosaic of then Czechoslovakia. All that changed by the Nazi occupation in 1939. In its course, some 85% of the Czech Jewish population disappeared in the Shoah. Less than 3 years after the war, the country was overtaken by the communist regime, which lasted for another 40 years, and for most of its time, it espoused all kinds and levels of anti-Semitic views. These either further suppressed the remaining Jewish population of the country and made them hide their Jewishness, or drove many of them away into emigration. The result of these two scourges is that today's Czech Jewish population numbers only several thousand members who are in about 10 Jewish communities around the country. About half of them live in the capital of the Czech Republic, in Prague. The new freedom, however, brought also a renewed interest, and ever more people discover and research their Jewish roots. Some of them eventually return to Jewish life. Despite the relatively low overall number, the community is regaining at least part of its vibrancy and diversity, and we see new Jewish groups and associations being created, old organizations restored, and various strands of Judaism that regularly practice or hold their services. Above all, we should also stress that there are various forms of Jewish education that make sure that the incoming generation will carry on. Part of all this mix is also a very special relation between the Czech Republic and the State of Israel, which has a very long history. The book that we are launching today will provide still more background to all these efforts and showing us that there really is a lot of solid ground in the history of Czech Jews to build the future on, so that the future historians have just as much to write about. Thank you very much for your attention.
Am I on? Yes. Thank you very much for your kind words. And without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce, at least very briefly, the moderator of tonight's evening, and of this wonderful book that we are all so excited about, Prague and Beyond. And I'd like to welcome Bryant, who's the author of the recently published Prague Belonging and the Modern City, as well as Prague in Black, Nazi Rule and Czech Nationalism. He's winner of the Hans Rosenberg Book Prize. Bryant is Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and has received fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies and the National Humanities Center. He is with Katerina Capkova and Diane Dumitru, writing a history of the Stalinist era show trials in communist Czechoslovakia. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming. This is a wonderful audience, and I think the loud claps show that we're all very excited to be doing this again. So a big round of applause again for all of you, and again thank you. And of course we're here to talk about this book, which is also has come out in German a few years ago and will now be in Czech in 2 weeks. So this in itself is quite an achievement, I must say, as someone who's tried to get things translated before and worked with 3 different publishers. And the editors have much to be proud of, not just for publishing this in 3 different languages, but also working with a team of scholars that hail from very different academic cultures, both in Central Europe and the United States as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the 4 panelists here, and then I'm going to say a few words and then allow them to tell you a little bit about this book, Prague and Beyond, Jews in the Bohemian Lands, which I've read twice now, and the second time was even better, I must say. So Hillel J. Kieval is the Gloria M. Goldstein Professor of Jewish History and Thought at Washington University in St. Louis. His research interests range from pathways of Jewish acculturation and integration to the impact of nationalism and ethnic conflict on modern Jewish identities, and from cross-cultural conflicts and misunderstandings to the discursive practices of modern anti-Semitism. His publications are numerous, and they include The Making of Czech Jewry, National Conflict in Jewish Society in Bohemia, 1870 to 1918. Languages of Community, The Jewish Experience in the Czech Lands, and Blood Inscriptions, Science, Modernity, and Ritual Murder in Europe's Fin de siècle, which was just appeared 2 months ago, is that right? Yeah. And Professor Kieval, just 2 weeks ago, received the Charles University Faculty of Arts Silver Medal, which is an extraordinarily prestigious award. So congratulations. Extremely well deserved. Katerina Capkova is a senior researcher at the Institute of Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. She teaches at Charles University and New York University in Prague as well. In 2006, she established the Prague Forum for Romani Histories, and her book, Czechs, Germans, and Jews, National Identity and the Jews of Bohemia, received the Outstanding Academic Title of 2012 Award from Choice Magazine. She's also co-authored with Michal Frankl, Unsichere Zuflucht, a book about refugees from Nazi Germany and Austria who fled to Czechoslovakia. And she's the editor of another volume on Jewish and Romani families in the Holocaust and its aftermath that was published in 2020. Benjamin Frommer, he's next on my list, so go this way, is Associate Professor of History at Northwestern University and is the author of National Cleansing, Retribution Against Nazi Collaborators in Postwar Czechoslovakia, which was published in Czech translation in 2010. He's also co-edited a book called Intermarriage from Central Europe to Central Asia, Mixed Families in the Age of Extremes, which was published 2 years ago. And he is currently completing a manuscript entitled A Ghetto Without Walls, The Jews of the Nazi Protectorate of Bohemian Moravia. And finally, next to me here is Verena Kasper Marienberg, who is an assistant professor and soon to be associate professor in the history department of North Carolina State University. And her research focuses on Jewish legal history, Jewish Christian shared spaces, and Jewish daily life in the early modern Holy Roman Empire in Bohemia. Her book about Jewish litigation at the Emperor's Court in Vienna won the Arnsberg Prize in Jewish Studies, and currently she is completing a microhistorical study of the Frankfurt Jewish community in the 18th century. Okay, so just a few words of my own sort of thoughts about this book before I hand over the microphone to first the editors and then two of the contributors. First, I just want to underline again, like what I think this is what an extraordinary achievement this book is. Not just as someone who's co-edited a couple of volumes and understands the challenges of bringing a lot of people together to compose something, but also to compose something that is groundbreaking, coherent, and extremely well written. This book represents in many ways a whole generation of scholarship that has been underway ever since the fall of communism. Scholarship that's been taking place not just in Central Europe, in the Bohemian Lands of the Czech Republic and Germany and the US, but elsewhere as well. And what's also extraordinary about this book is not only does it have many different authors who the editors have managed to sort of bring together to tell one coherent story, but it's also a mixture of secondary sources, that is previous scholarship, but also one that draws on a lot of really fascinating primary sources. So just for example, in Verena's chapter, which she co-wrote with Joshua Teplitsky, it begins with a travelogue, as several other chapters do, and also has this fascinating treasure trove of letters. I love these letters that were supposed to go to Vienna just as the 30 Years' War was about to begin, and somehow ended up in the Vienna archives. These are the types of things that, as historians, we live for. And this book really brings to life not just the history of this land and of the Jews in this land, but of how these sources can tell stories. And I also want to say, I think this is one of these, it's a type of book that's going to be with us for a very long time. Because it tells this grand story of the Jews of Bohemia over several hundred years, and because it is so fluidly written, and because it encapsulates so well the scholarship of the time, and yet is accessible to a general audience, my prediction is that whoever writes or talks about Jewish history in this land will have to in some way engage with this book. So, that said, I'm going to pass the microphone on to the editors here, and I asked everybody to begin the conversation by telling us, in a page or two, what they would like you to know about this book, and then I'm going to ask a few questions as follow-up, and then we will allow time for everybody else to ask some questions as well.
So
you can take your mask off if you're speaking.
Yeah?
Yeah, that was the rule.
Okay. So thank you so much. Thank you, Chet, for such a kind introduction. I would like to start with thanking Eva Derman and Pavla for organizing this event. It's really, we are so happy and thankful for this. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. It's really exciting to and it's such a joy and honor to be here with you and in person. The question was what we want people know about the book. I would start with something what Chet already mentioned. For me, it is really it is a result of approximately 8 years of teamwork. And the book was written by 9 scholars, 5 men, 4 women, from 5 countries, who are specialists in different periods, different topics. And what I find really unique is that those 9 people came together and decided to share with each other the latest research results of their projects. They have shared these research results in order to create a new interpretation of the history of Jews in the Bohemian Lands from the early modern period up to now. So this is, from my point of view, the major achievement of this book, and I would like to thank all my co-authors here, but also I would like to thank to those who are unfortunately not with us today for such an excellent cooperation. It was really such a great experience, and I'm so thankful for that. I think in order to show what is the specifics of this book, we also have to speak about the books which also tried, like us, to summarize somehow the history of Jews in the Bohemian Lands and that were published before. I think we should mention those books. There are several individual projects written by individual historians, mostly from the 70s or 80s. I have in mind historians like Ruth Kestenberg-Gladstein, Vilma Igers, Rudolf Vlašek, and Tomáš Pěkný. All those books are very important contributions to the field. At the same time, it is obvious that an individual cannot do original research for history which lasts several centuries. There is, however, a monumental and unique project of the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews, the same society which is hosting us today, which is totally, which is important for anybody who is interested in history of the Czechoslovak Jews, and that's the 3 volumes called The Jews of Czechoslovakia. Anybody who is interested in those topics has to have those 3 volumes. I myself, I'm very thankful to Petr Brod, maybe some of you know him, who gave me those 3 volumes some 30 years ago. This book, or the 3 volumes, were published at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. And I think it is important to understand the time. It was still at the time when the genocide, the Holocaust, was in vivid memory of everybody. The book was published by, I may say, intellectual elite of the Czechoslovak Jewish exile community, especially here in America, but also in Israel and in Western Europe. And we can say that all of those authors have lost many of their relatives, friends, colleagues during the war. And this was definitely in their minds when they were writing those volumes. At the same time, some of those authors, by this I mean especially Kurt Wehle, who was a key personality in re-establishing the Jewish communal life in Czechoslovakia after the war. He had, however, to leave Czechoslovakia because of the rise of communism. So I would like to emphasize that this monumental book, which precedes our project, is, if I may say in one word what it is, for me it's a testament. It's a monument to the Czechoslovak Jewish communities that were just destroyed. And it was written by people who, in many ways, themselves shaped the history of Czechoslovak Jews because they were active in the Zionist movement, in Czech Jewish movement, in B'nai Brit. There were also famous writers among the authors like Egon Hostovsky, Viktor Fischl. So in a sense, it's a very different project from ours. If I may say, for me, the Jews of Czechoslovakia is not that much secondary literature. For me, it's really a very unique primary source, and this will remain for the future generations as well. And now, if I may contrast this very unique book project with ours, it's very different. It's written by 9 historians, academics, who could do research in Czech Republic, Slovakia, in Israel, in the US. And so again, we can say the timing was important. This project would never be possible without the fall of communism. It's really unique that in the team there are people who have the experience of communism, like myself, but there are, of course, many who did not grow up in communism. And the fact that we were equal partners, even though we have different linguistic background, religious background, even though he studied at very different universities, it's really for me a great, not only achievement, but it was great joy that we are that far. And in a sense, it is a sign that the historiography is at another point of possibilities. Thank you.
Good evening. Just a few words to add on to Katka's excellent summary and perspective on this project. I will begin by saying that when you spoke about the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews and those 3 volumes that you mentioned, I had visions of myself as a graduate student working on my dissertation and other papers, and really those 3 works were the foundation from which one might be able to, if one were lucky, one might be able to build upon and to build something else. So it was quite an accomplishment in its own right. That project, for our book to be seen in some respects as a successor to that, is a great honor. So I would just, in talking about Prague and Beyond and the work that went into it and our strategies for accomplishing this, 3 words came to my mind, all adjectives. One was comprehensive. We wanted this book to be complete in some ways, that to provide a coherent, almost seamless historical narrative from the late Middle Ages to yesterday's newspaper. And the second is collaborative. This unlike many collected volumes, this one really involved all of us sitting together to work out the project, and then sitting together again 2 more times to go over everyone's work. And so everyone had a chance to know what the goals and methods were of their fellow authors, and to read that work, to make comments, and to see if we could change an essay here or there to make it connect to the previous one and also to the one that followed, so that it really was consciously a collaborative work. I'd never been involved in a project like that before, and it was really very satisfying. And the third C would be creative. That is to say, Interpretive is another word that we used. Though it is collaborative, and though we wanted to make sure that this read as a single historical narrative, we also realized and encouraged each individual author or set of authors to be able to put forward their own interpretation of their time period. And so, in a sense, there is not any one single argument in this book, but each chapter tries hard to interpret the experiences of Jews in the Bohemian Lands and to argue for some conclusion, for some specific understanding of that time period. And then finally, what is it that I want to say? I think I know. Yes, that we had another goal in mind as well in producing this work, and that is not to write a Jewish history which is separate and distinct from the history of the Bohemians and Moravians and Silesians who lived together with Jews, shoulder to shoulder, cheek to jowl. We wanted to produce a historical narrative in which Jewish experience was seen as being intrinsic to the history of the Bohemian Lands itself. And I think we managed to do that. At least I hope we did. So it's not a history about a group apart. And it's not a history about a group having history imposed on it, policies imposed on it, but rather collections of individuals and communities who are fully integrated into their environment, who are at home in their environment, and who also produce their own history. Thanks.
So good evening, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. Very much appreciated. So I was one of the authors, and is that?
You can take your mask off.
Right, brother, keep it on there. Is that
Okay.
Can you hear me all right with the microphone? A little louder. Okay, I can do that. Yes, let's.
Yes, please.
All right then. Yeah, so there's, I agree, of course, with everything that my co-authors said, and I also had the distinct pleasure of working as a team on this book. I think that makes really the special character of it, and that we had the time to do this over several years also includes the appreciation of the funding that we got for this book from several foundations that I think might be worth naming as well. So these kind of team projects do need funding, and they are worth the funding, and I think our book is a wonderful product to show that this is, right, like long-term funding through institutions is can produce beautiful products. For our chapter in particular, I worked with my colleague Josh Jablitsky on the early modern and medieval chapter. I think for us was a particular challenge to bring out these personal accounts that we really wanted to put in the foreground of our history, the personal stories, the voices from the past. That is particularly difficult to do in an early modern and medieval setting, simply because we often do not have the sources. So we were really looking through a lot of secondary literature and through primary sources to find those voices. And of course, in many ways, there are singular voices that are not necessarily representative, and one can say, why did you take out this voice while you don't hear others? And that is a fully legitimate concern, and yet, right, we have a limited selection that we could choose from, and we did choose carefully those that did represent a wide variety of the Jewish experience in the Bohemian Lands, that try to connect with different social status, to also hear not only the elite, but also those that worked, for example, as maids and servants in households, young women and men that traveled, students, right, to get a big diversity of the society of the early modern period, because I think we often don't realize how diverse this actually was. And that adds to the point that my colleagues already mentioned, this internal or intra-Jewish view, right, that gives us a much more nuanced version of the Jewish experience, since external sources often tell us a story about the minority and as a homogeneous group, and we don't see many differences within the group. And that is something that we can confront with these internal sources in a new way. Even though they reflect only one person or two persons at a time, I think they can help us understand the variety. And maybe if I can choose one more, and then I think I'll hand over the word and get back to that later, is also one of the big topics that we really wanted to address, is the mobility and migration that really goes as a red thread through the history of the Bohemian Jews, or the Jews of the Bohemian Lands, and see that not only as a migration that follows pogroms and persecution, but that it was a constant feature of not only Jewish life, but the lives of many Bohemians and many people at the time. And that doesn't only mean migration in a broader scheme, although it does that as well, but also within the Bohemian lands, right? That people were mobile and communities were changing, and there was a lot of dynamic in this, which we often don't see because we think of pre-modern societies often as very sedentary and not as mobile as they actually were. And with those people did not only move goods, but also ideas, and I hope that's something that we really also try to address in our book, the exchange of ideas and the intercultural exchange of ideas across religious boundaries.
Thank you. So I'm going last. You've already heard about the book more generally. I was the author of the chapter on the Holocaust and the Second World War, and I guess for my brief few words here, I'd like to talk about how, and I think this applies to the other chapters, what the title in effect means in practice and how we took it seriously. It's a book that, to take the subtitle first, is about the Jews of and in the Bohemian lands. And to that respect, as you just heard, it looks at Jews and among non-Jews as interacting with non-Jews, but also from the perspective of Jews themselves. And when it comes to the Holocaust, traditionally the history of the Holocaust for decades, and this is true as well of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, focused on Nazi policy, on a top-down perspective of what was done to the Jews. And in my chapter, and I think in the book as a whole, an effort to understand how it was experienced by the Jews to lose their livelihoods, their relationships, their homes, and eventually their lives. To take the first part of the title, the main title, Prague and Beyond, I think all of us also took very seriously the beyond. The history of the Holocaust in Bohemia and Moravia has very traditionally and quite often, almost across the board in the major books, been told as a history of the Jews of Prague. And in fact, the Jews outside of Prague experienced this brief and truly traumatic experience quite differently for a number of reasons. And so I'd just like to give you very briefly 3 examples from the chapter that show these 2 aspects of a Jewish perspective and outside of Prague. The first is the experience of movement. Movement which was a universal experience. Practically all the Jews who lived in this territory had to move once, if not twice, if not 3 times prior to the moment that they boarded transport trains to Theresienstadt or elsewhere. But this meant something different outside of Prague than it did within Prague. In Prague, it often meant moving from a nicer apartment to a smaller one, being crowded in with other people, but staying within your home community. For the Jews outside, it meant fleeing Ostrava in a wave of anti-Semitic violence in June of 1939 when more than a half dozen synagogues were set alight. It meant going to small towns from big cities or going to big cities from small towns, often being forced to leave into specific locations. One of the ones not extraordinarily well known, but in fact in many ways the most traumatic, was in the spring of 1940 when the Jews of Mlada Boleslav, just north of Prague, the entire community as well as that of some neighboring towns were forced into the castle in the center of the city and lived for the next 2.5 years there, in effect in a ghetto until they were deported among the last Jews to Theresienstadt. And it isn't that the experience of schooling that's well known in Prague, the experience of the children who went to the Yakimov school, in particular Petr Gins and others, is one that's not shared outside of Prague, where in most places outside of Brno and Prague, there were no opportunities for children to even go to Jewish schools. And so their families scrambled to hire them wandering teachers. First, potentially, the Czech teachers, but when that was banned, Jews who had lost their jobs found spaces in attics in the back of storefronts that had been closed to try and educate their children, and this was a struggle. And then a third example, probably many of you are familiar of the experience in Prague of families waiting, being afraid of the knock on the door, the ring at the bell and the summons coming, and seeing their friends and relatives be taken off and knowing that their time would come. Over a period of months and years, in fact, from the first deportations in the fall of 1941 until the community leaders were sent off in the summer of 1943. But outside of Prague, that experience was actually quite different. Almost everywhere outside of Prague, with perhaps the partial exception of Brno, the deportations came at once. The transports came during a brief period, often just a week, 2, 3, 4 in Ostrava, perhaps more transports, where there was a period that led for years and months beforehand where Jews lived among non-Jews, and then overnight the Jews were no more. And this was something that meant this was not a gradual process, but a thunderclap that irrevocably changed these communities, not just for the Jews, but also the non-Jews. So in the chapter, for example, I talk about the small city of Chest in Vysočina in the Bohemian Moravian highlands, just south of Jihlava, that experienced first receiving dozens of Jews who had been expelled from Jihlava, settling them among the community, and then overnight being forced to leave to go to Třebíč, and then within a few days being sent to Theresienstadt, and then for many on further to places like Treblinka and Auschwitz, of course. And so in a sense, this is an attempt to show not only that there was a universal, you could say a general story of the Holocaust, but there were many individual stories, community stories of the Holocaust, in which we can draw upon not just the archives that my colleagues have mentioned, but one of the really great aspects that we've seen over the past 20, 30 years is a wealth of local studies, of local historians, of archivists, of librarians whose work have been published in local presses and haven't necessarily made it into the major works in Prague. And I think that's one of the great things that we can bring forth in this coverage that takes us over Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia as a whole. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to ask one more question of each of the contributors here. And before I do that, I want to underline something that Hillel said, is that one of the many contributions of this book is to make a very strong argument that Jewish history is integral, intrinsic, I think he said, to Bohemian history. And it's impossible to imagine a Bohemian history without Jewish history. And that includes in this book an unflinching look at anti-Semitism. That includes the ways that the various states and administrators, kings, governments, and so forth have organized Jewish life and sometimes repressed Jewish life. But it also is a wonderful celebration. I think testament was Katarina's word to the ways that Jews have contributed to the history of Bohemia in many positive ways as well. Oh yeah, sure, I'll do that. And that needs to be remembered. And that I think that, again, this is one reason why this book is not just going to be talked about and referred to by scholars of Jewish history per se, but of scholars of the region more generally. So one thing that, maybe I should come and ask.
No, yeah, that's a good distance.
Yeah, I'll stay back. So one thing that I was going to, as a final sort of question of each of those, is as I was rereading the book again today, each of your chapters, there was one thing that was reminding myself of what I was surprised about, something that struck me as quite original. And as someone who studied has studied this region for longer than I cared to admit. And so for Verena, I'll ask them one at a time, and then you can go in order. So Verena, what I was I think I was surprised at, and I think that everybody else would like to hear about too, is my image of Jewish life before the 18th century is one of segregation. And yet you talk in the, if I remember, the last half or the last third of the chapter about all these different interactions with the Christian population. I was wondering if you could talk about that. And Hillel, what I struck about it with yours is, again, with this, playing with this idea of space and segregation, about the different sort of obstacles to buying property and movement within cities and localities after the decrees of the late 18th century, which are often hailed as the beginning of emancipation and leaving the ghetto, that are culminate in the revolutions of 1848. So if you wouldn't mind saying. And for Ben, maybe just to maybe develop this idea of ghetto without walls, which is also central to his chapter. And for Katarzyna, what I was struck at, and I keep coming back to this because this is something I didn't know for so long, is how the extraordinary migration that took place after World War II, largely from Ruthenia and the eastern parts of the former Czechoslovakia into the Bohemian Lands, which transformed the character of Jewish organizations, but also Jewish life, especially in the lands where many Sudeten Germans had lived and were then expelled. So that's maybe one for each of you. And then after that, I think we'll open up questions to the audience.
Start?
Yeah, maybe
Okay,
chronologically.
I'll start chronologically. Exactly. So yes, that was one of our big arguments in this chapter, based on the more wider European literature in the last decade, and that is expanding the Jewish experience, the history of the Jewish experience beyond urban spaces. The ghetto has for decades dominated historiography of Jewish history, right? That was the major narrative, that Jews were segregated in ghettos in the big cities, and that is in many ways true for the big urban centers. When you look for Prague, for Frankfurt, for Venice, right, these really early ghettos. But it is not true for the countryside. And as we know now is that, and that happened in different European countries at a different time, that more and more Jews moved to the countryside. So for the Holy Roman Empire, we assume that by the mid-17th century, about 80 to 90% of Jews lived in the countryside and not in the city. For Bohemia, we have a little higher urban population, but still about 2/3 after the 30 Years' War in the mid-17th century lived on the countryside. And we know so little about their experience. And clearly their experience of life was different because they lived with their Christian neighbors, either next door, sometimes sharing a house, right? So very intimate neighborhood with all the good and bad that came with it. So we didn't want to romanticize this history in any way that this is now, right, a full integration and they were all best friends. It was certainly not so. And we brought in primary sources and autobiographic sketches that speak to the fears that came with it. But it was not only fear, right? The fact that they lived over more than centuries on this countryside speaks that there was a modus vivendi of sorts, right, that worked in both ways, and that they were neighbors, sometimes good neighbors and sometimes not good neighbors, right? And migration, of course, plays a big role in this. But then the question also, what does that mean, living a Jewish life in the countryside? And in many ways, we have to rely here on research from other European areas, like the Holy Roman Empire, like the Alsace or northern Italy, where we know more. There is more research there. So we are kind of lacking behind in the research on the Bohemian Lands in that. So this book, in a way, is a first try to get that really in the broader picture and to show that the Bohemian Lands were in no way different than other regions of Europe. So to bring this comparative view in. And we see that Jewish religious life in particular was different, right? Because often there was just one family or two families in a small Bohemian village that didn't necessarily have a synagogue or have someone to get kosher meat from, or have other religious rituals, be able to live that in the same way that an urban community could offer the infrastructure for. So that it was our intention to show how communities, if we can even call them communities or settlements, try to cooperate over distances and try to share certain services that they needed to maintain a certain level of Jewish life, but that this was not necessarily the same or the same observant than it was in the urban communities. That, of course, goes a little bit against a longer narrative of that before the Enlightenment, right? All these communities were very traditional, were all absolutely observant, and there was no such thing as secularization, and I say that in a quotation mark because it's a little early to talk about this. But we do see different forms of Jewish life, right? And without any judgment, what is more observant or less, it was different forms of observance that we see there, that we have to include in our narrative of Jewish religious life by looking at the countryside as well.
Yes, there's so much here to talk about. I don't know whether to begin with the state or with demographic patterns. Maybe I'll try to combine them a little bit. So I work on, in this book, I'm working on the period of time that begins with the death of the self-consciously radical, almost revolutionary emperor, Joseph II, in 1790, and then goes to the years just before the completion of Jewish political emancipation in the 1860s. And this is a period in which a process of cultural change, educational change, social behavior set in motion largely by the state under Joseph II has had important effects on Jewish identity in the Bohemian Lands, Jewish culture, language choice, the types of schools that one sent one's children to, but also expectations about mobility, occupational opportunity, movement, etc. And the problem is that following the death of Joseph and following the French Revolution and the wars between the Central European states and revolutionary and then Napoleonic France, the state wasn't so sure that it wanted to continue this experiment with its Jewish population. Didn't exactly know what it wanted to do. So one had a situation in which Jews were ready to follow through on a program of educational, cultural, and occupational change, ready to take advantage of that, ready to move from the countryside to the cities, and from within the capital of Prague, they were ready to move outside the confines of the Jewish city, the Jewish town, into other more fashionable neighborhoods. And so there's considerable tension here, and the state and the Jewish population are often not on the same page. That produces some interesting conflicts, one of which has to do with the question of where Jews can settle. So throughout the first half of the 19th century, down to the revolutionary period of 1848, Jews in Bohemia and Moravia could not live wherever they wanted to, geographically, that is. They couldn't move to any and all towns or cities. A number of cities, smaller cities and larger towns, maintained the right, one in the Middle Ages, not to tolerate Jewish presence. And cities like Brno, for example, the capital of Moravia, enjoyed this privilege of not having a Jewish population, and that meant that Moravian Jews could not move to Brno until after 1848. And in the context of Prague, for example, here factory owners, entrepreneurs, and other Jews involved in the expansion of the Bohemian economy wanted the right to leave the Jewish quarter, and they complained to the Bohemian governor's office that there wasn't room, that there was overcrowding, that it was unsanitary, that there was disease in the quarter, and they wanted permission to settle outside. Sometimes this permission was granted by the governor's office and by the city or by the city fathers. Oftentimes it was refused. Nevertheless, by the 1840s, not only had the Jewish quarter expanded once or twice in the previous half century, but now scores of Jewish families, maybe even a few hundred of Jewish families, were moving out and living in the more fashionable, well-to-do neighborhoods of Prague I and Prague II. Sometimes with very strong opposition from these neighborhoods and from the local Prague population, but not always. So in other words, sometimes the economic competitors to Prague Jews complained and to the governor's office and insisted that these Jews be forced to return to their quarter. But there are records of other Czech neighbors, Prague neighbors, especially landlords, who pleaded with the government to let the Jews stay there, to stay in these neighborhoods, arguing that they were peaceful, they were quiet, they paid their rent on time, and we would take a terrible economic hit if you forced these people back to those communities. So what I was trying to show in this chapter was the tension that existed between unfulfilled hopes and expectations on the part of the Jewish population that had been conditioned to expect integration and to expect mobility and the rewards from such, and a very conservative government that wasn't quite sure, could never make up its mind what it wanted to do with the Jewish population. There are other interesting conflicts involving the presence of yeshiva bochers on the streets of Prague who sought employment in Jewish families as private tutors, and then set themselves up, if you will, as competitors to the German Jewish schools, public schools that had been created by the community at the government's behest. What are we going to do with these yeshiva bochers? The Bohemian authorities wanted to know. And there are questions also about whom should we recognize as rabbis? What does a rabbi, what should the educational profile of a rabbi be? Does the rabbi need to be fluent in German, for example? Does the rabbi need to have a university education? Or is a traditional Talmudic education sufficient? What is a Talmudic education anyway? And so these kinds of discussions and debates also took place. Let me just close by mentioning that one of the more famous of Prague's 19th century rabbis, Solomon Judah Rappaport, who was was the chief rabbi of Prague from around 1840 to 1867. His appointment was almost rejected by the government because he migrated to Prague from Poland, where he had only, I put only in quotation marks, all right, he had only a traditional Jewish education, including advanced textual training, rabbinical training, although he was somewhat self-taught, if you will, in the historical sciences and in European Enlightenment. But he faced the prospect of being rejected by the government because he wasn't a university graduate. And it was only some kind of fancy footwork on the part of the Prague Jewish community and acquiescence on the part of the Bohemian gubernia that allowed an exception to be made in this case, and Solomon Judah Rappaport, his appointment was recognized.
So thank you for the question, Chad. The Ghetto Without the Walls is the working title of my own manuscript, but it actually comes from Miroslav Karny, who was really the pioneer of study of the Holocaust in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia outside of Theresienstadt. There were some earlier books, but Carney really looked in depth at the first time. And it describes, as Carney describes it, the ratcheting up or the tightening of the vice of anti-Jewish regulations that ban Jews from going to mixed eating and drinking establishments, from going to the movie theater, from going to certain stores at certain times, that more and more greatly restricted Jews, both in terms of times of the day and in terms of places they go and things they could do, and segregated them from non-Jews. And though it was not visible in their daily lives as they walked the streets, they became more and more restricted and in a sense ghettoized over the course from the spring, really the summer of 1939, until their eventual transport. But continuing on the theme of the difference between Prague and beyond, this of course meant something different in a place like Prague where there were tens of thousands of Jews, and it was worthwhile for a time for pubs and restaurants to set aside a separate Jewish room that Jews could go to, as opposed to in a smaller city, a town, or even in a village pub where that was not possible, and so it meant that Jews were completely banned. But in fact, the ghetto without walls really comes fully into effect in September of 1941, when at roughly the same time as Jews were made to wear yellow stars, at roughly the same time that the synagogues were shut down by the Nazis, the Nazis also declared that Jews could no longer leave their home communities, the towns and villages, the Obce that they lived in, the communities, without permission from the authorities. That meant something very different in Prague, where one could go for miles and kilometers, although you couldn't use the public transportation quite often, without any restriction on your daily life to see friends and to see family, than in a small town like Kolín, not to mention a place like Telč or even a village, right? So to give an example, in Poděbrady, east of Prague, and in many other places in the Protectorate, the cemetery lay beyond the boundaries of the town or village. This meant that Jews could no longer visit their loved ones' graves. When someone was buried in these towns, the community would get permission only for 3 members of the community to go to lower the coffin into the grave. Or to give other examples of families where fathers or mothers could not visit the children who are staying with their divorced husband or wife because they live in a different community. And so outside of Prague in particular, this created really a barrier as Jews were wearing the yellow stars that restricted people more and more to smaller and smaller areas. To give just one more example of people, if you know this area, Počatky and Žirovnica on the border again between Bohemia and Moravia are 2 joined towns which share services, and yet at this time they were divided, and suddenly Jews could no longer function as one community, and even that one community was split in 2. And so this experience of this ghetto without walls varied substantially, place to place, community to community. And again, to the extent that many Jews, if not nearly all Jews, either ended up in emigration or ended up in ghettos, in killing centers, and in fact overwhelmingly ended up dead, the endpoints were similar, but in fact the journeys that got them there were substantially different, and that's something that try to recapture in this chapter and in general.
So thank you. So for my chapter, which is the last one, it's the post-war period. I can actually come back to what Verena mentioned before about the first chapter. It's in a sense an opposite, that the expectations for the post-war and the common narrative is that after the war, because of the genocide, because of communism, there was a very high, it is called assimilation of Jews, and therefore especially the religious life is somehow getting less and less space in people's lives. And I must admit that I myself was very much surprised when I started my research about this period, that the reality is actually very different. And this is because, as Chet mentioned, because of the very important migration of especially Carpathian Jews from Carpathian Ruthenia, which belonged to the Czechoslovak state before the war, and which was annexed by Soviet Union in 1945. And it's really a paradox that it's not only that we can, I actually question the very concept of assimilation, but not only that, it is precisely after the Shoah that the Bohemian Lands had for the first time communities with Hasidim and with Hasidic ritus or rituals, especially because, as Chet mentioned, many of those Carpathian Jews have decided to settle in the border region called Sudetenland during the war, where the Germans were expelled, and where they also a little bit away from the Prague center, they could have full control over the communities. They built mostly like 90–95% of the members of the community, so they could shape completely the community life. And it's really a paradox, and I think it's really extremely interesting to see this actually flourishing communities in the 50s, in the 60s, in the Stalinist years, which is a huge paradox. And I was myself very surprised, and I've been lucky to find some people who could share, or who were willing to share their private documents for this, and so this is another thesis of this book.
Thank you. And I should add too, like another part of the second half of that chapter talks about the anti-Semitism after, after 1968, in the years before 1989. So with that said, I would like to open the floor to questions, and let Pablo hear.
Could we wait for that?
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. I'm not of Bohemian ancestry. I'm a Romanian Jew. But I do know about the Sudetenland because where I was born in near Czernowitz in Hermannstadt, everyone spoke German. And my question, though, is about the Middle Ages, where so much was going on besides the plague, the blood libel, the Crusades. Did you manage to find primary, secondary, tertiary sources in the church or churches in the Bohemian Lands? Was anything written down, anything available that could be used for this magnum opus?
I guess that's me. So with that said, we have a look back into the Middle Ages, but we kind of, as our framework, did choose the Habsburg years. So we do start with the 16th century. That said, we are looking back, right, because it is, of course, the pretext and the prehistory of what is happening, and particularly the persecutions are. So both my co-author and I are not medievalists, so we are not necessarily working with primary sources in the archive, but certainly there are. There are always less than we have for later periods, but particularly concerning blood libels, crusades, as far as they reached there, yes, there are certainly documents. There are also actually 19th and early 20th century editions of those, often like, what is the yeah, different like sources from authorities, church authorities, state authorities, noble authorities, right? So these are in many ways our best, are sources that are very good available because they are edited. Of course, they are limited, right? Because yet again, they give us this perspective from the outside, from the authority, from the state. It tells us very little about the experience, right? Which was, in a way, a reason to not include it that much. But we do have, not necessarily from Bohemia, but we do have autobiographic, or at least one or two generations removed descriptions of how that was experienced by the Jewish population. We tried to include them as best as we could.
This is the first time I've been here. I confessed I feel a little lost. You mentioned Czechoslovakia, Bohemian Lands, Bohemia, Ruthenia, Silesia. What happened to Slovakia, where my family is from and where I was actually born? I mean, I can't follow, all the various border. This is the United States. Got just two separations here. So it's a little confusing, and my grandparents were actually in Theresienstadt. Is Theresienstadt in Slovakia? No. Yeah, so what happened with Slovakia, which I speak Slovak?
So thank you for this. No. It's I'm very happy about your question, and I'm sorry that we have not mentioned Slovakia in detail. It's there is quite some there is a space for Slovakia in especially in the chapter about the interval period between the First and Second World War, and because
There are two, Katerina, there are two questions. Katerina, there are two questions. Why is Slovakia not in the book? And then what happened to Slovakia Jews? And I think you're asking.
do you want to
Right. So do you want to? Well, there are two questions. One, the book looks primarily at what is today the Czech Republic. And that's primarily because through the course of most of the history of this region, the Jewish communities of Bohemia and Moravia, today's Czech Republic, developed separately from the Jewish community of Slovakia, which was part of Hungary, and developed generally later as a result of immigration from, and correct me if I'm wrong, but across the border from what was once Poland, Lithuania. So really the Jewish communities, although there's interaction, the Jewish communities of what became Slovakia and what became Czechia are really joined together for the first time in a country, although they're in Austria-Hungary and the Habsburg Lands, but in 1918. And that's why the Slovak Jews play a larger role in the interwar chapter. And then in 1939, they're separated again. And that's why my chapter doesn't look at the Slovak Holocaust, because on March 14th, 15th, 1939, Slovakia declared independence. However, Slovakia declared independence in March 1939. Hungary took areas as well. Slovak Jews are deported to Theresienstadt, Terezín, which is in the Protectorate, so it's in Bohemia, Moravia, just as Danish Jews are sent there and Dutch Jews are sent there and German Jews are sent there. But they're not sent there because they were part of some Czechoslovakia, they're sent there because of that. And then the country is, of course, brought together again in 1945, and that's Katarzyna's chapter. Really, after 1945, more than any time before, you have a common history, I would say. So it's a combination of an answer about the book and why we're talking about what is today the Czech Republic, Bohemia, Moravia, part of Silesia, and a different story, absolutely fascinating, needs to be written in much the same way, of Jews in what became Slovakia and is Slovakia today. And so, yeah, if you want to add something to that.
Thank you. That's a great question. Thank you.
Oh, I'm not in charge. He's in charge.
I think
Don't look at me.
Yes, hi. It's an interesting talk. It's an interesting topic. I'm wondering if any of you had the opportunity to take a look at the Familian Laws that provided a certain degree of protection and property to Bohemian Jews, and whether or not that contributed to a segregation or to an integration into the communities where the Familians were.
Well, I will try that. It comes up in my chapter, and especially in the one before mine, which is written by Michael Miller from Central European University. The questioner wanted to know about the Familiantengesetze, or the Familiance Laws, which seems very arcane, and it is a little bit, so I'll try to explain what they were, and also what the repercussions, short-term and long-term, of the Familiance Laws were. In the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, some of the Czech nobility and representatives of the Austrian government, the Habsburg government, were concerned that the Jewish population in Bohemia and Moravia and Silesia was getting too large, and that while the Christian population had suffered tremendous losses in the 30 Years' War, they thought incorrectly that the Jewish population did not. Somehow it escaped those losses, and also that they were multiplying too fast. And the state took it upon itself to engage in some social engineering by limiting by law the size of Jewish families. And the way it did this, this law comes into effect first in 1726, and it actually lasts for well over 100 years. These laws are in effect until 1848, which is when they finally are abrogated. So what did the laws say? The Familiance Laws, first of all, base themselves on some kind of a census of the Jewish population in this region. And they counted up what they thought were the number of Jewish households led by a Jewish householder. So these are the Familianten. And each one of these householders was given a number, and that number in any given region was not supposed to be exceeded. So the way they would keep this population at bay was to limit the right to marry and set up a household of their own to the eldest son in a household. This meant that the girls in the household presumably would be married, but they would marry, if they wanted to stay where they lived, they would marry someone with a number, and would be able to stay. The younger sons of the household had a real dilemma. And so if we imagine that maybe there were, say, 6 kids per family, it could be as many as 4 sons in a household, had a dilemma. Would they marry? Would they not marry? Would they emigrate? And many of them chose to migrate. From Bohemia, many migrated to Poland, Lithuania. From Moravia, most migrated to Hungary, actually, and one of the origins of what became a large, immense Jewish population in 19th and 20th century Hungary, the origins were directly related to the Familiance Laws and to the migration of Moravian Jews. Another option you could have to try to escape the purview, the oversight of the state. And so I'm pretty convinced that a number of younger sons, they left Prague and larger towns for the countryside and sought refuge, especially in the Bohemian countryside, in villages under the direct control of the nobility and not the direct control of the Habsburg state. That then increased this odd demographic profile of Bohemian Jews with a large community at the center, the Prague Jewish community, almost no middle-sized communities at all, and a kind of centrifugal pattern of villages, of rural Jewish life, which is what we talked about also. One or two families per village, which raises all sorts of so this doesn't change until 1848, but it has an effect on the continuities of Jewish life in other parts of East Central Europe, southern Poland and central Poland, and especially Hungary. Who's choosing? Oh, okay.
Thank you. Because obviously you're very, very knowledgeable on this subject, and we aren't for the most part, would you kindly share with us one fact, only one fact, that you learned in your study and production of this book that you never knew before and found interesting? And
That's
share
a
it
great
with
question.
us,
Putting us on the
please.
spot. Someone else has to do it.
That's a great question. Well, they started writing this a long time ago, so it might take some time to think.
Well, one thing I didn't know before I began my research for my chapter was that the younger brother of a long-time, very well-known Vienna rabbi named Adolf Yelinek, who was first a preacher, a prediger in the Vienna Jewish community, and then the chief rabbi of Vienna for many years. His younger brother was executed by the Habsburg forces in November 1848 as a revolutionary. And that to me was, first of all, well, obviously a bit shocking, very dramatic. There's wonderful testimony to letters that he wrote on the eve of his execution, his relationship to his father, which was not good, and his marriage to a non-Jewish woman, the relationship to the brother, who is a paragon of the community, but it also, and his final words to the firing squad apparently were, he tried to convince them that this was a really stupid thing to do, and that it was not necessary, he wasn't guilty, and they should just forget the whole thing. And when he saw that that didn't work, that kind of rational argument didn't work, he gathered up all of his courage and he said, "All right, now shoot me," which they did. But I think what makes this story most interesting is that it forces us to realize that there are not very strict boundaries between, let's say, activity in the democratic revolutions and radicalism of 1848 and rabbinic education and being a communal rabbi in as important a population as Vienna. This is all part of the same story. And I think that's what makes this story so fascinating. And there's a third branch to that story. The third brother, the third of these Yelinek brothers, a Moravian Jew who migrates where? To Hungary, of course. So he settles in Hungary, he settles in Budapest, and he becomes the first director of the Budapest streetcar company. He creates the first streetcar line in the city of Budapest. So, chief rabbi, executed revolutionary, and entrepreneur, engineer who creates the Budapest streetcars.
If I may add to this, thank you so much for this provocative question. Of course, we could add some more stories for each of the chapter, but I must admit that next to the idea which was already mentioned here and which is obvious especially in the title of the Czech version, which is the undertitle of the Czech version is Společná cesta dějinami, so it's really about the shared history of Jews, non-Jews on the territory of Bohemian Lands. So if I may say what surprised me personally in the project, in the discussions, was rather the interconnectedness of the history throughout the centuries. It was really, we emphasized here that this dialogue between the Jewish history and the general history, if it exists, something like general history. But what is also unique, I think, in this project is that people who are doing early modern period were discussing the texts with us who are in the 20th century. And at the beginning, I think we all were a little bit skeptical what shared topics we could have. Also because we do not meet at the same conferences. There are special conferences for early modern and special for Holocaust and so on. And so if I would emphasize one thing which surprised me is how much it is connected and how much the comments of Josh and Verena were important for my chapter in the post-war period. So that was something I was really surprised by.
Yeah, maybe I can speak on, I mean, there were multiple experiences along this chapter that were new for me since, again, as I mentioned before, I worked in an urban community before, and there are just a lot of sources that are clear and always there for communities, and the structure is very clear. So going into the rural hinterland of Prague was, needed a lot of creativity, where to look for sources, what kind of sources could that be, what kind of spaces would we encounter. And I think the enriching experience was that we found in the sources that was very similar for the Jewish people that lived on the countryside. They had to be really creative, right? And so the observance and the solutions that they found for their daily problems were surprising, right? So one of them, for example, is that, again, I mentioned it before, right, where to get kosher meat, and there were not necessarily a ritual slaughter around. So in one of the smaller towns, they found a solution that they could go to the Christian slaughterers, right? They would clean out their kitchens and they could bring in someone to slaughter in there. So clearly the Christian slaughterers knew about ritual slaughter, right? Jewish ritual slaughter, they knew what was necessary. They offered them the possibility to do so, probably for a fee. But yet, right, it's like this kind of creativity that happens in the interaction between those two communities that I found the most enriching in broadening our perspective beyond the urban.
I think we can go on to other questions.
Do we have time for more questions, or do you think it's
One more?
one more? Okay.
Thank you so much to all of you for sharing your time with us and for this wonderful book, which I'm very excited to read. I wanted to ask a question that's sort of similar to the question that the woman here asked, but to spin it forward a little bit. When you read this book, what's the next big question you have as historians? In other words, you spoke a lot about how this book is built on the work of the three-volume Society for the History of Slovak Jews work, and there's a continuity there. But as historians, when you read this book, or when you write this book, as some of you did, what is the next big question that you're jazzed about exploring or looking at?
You wrote the last chapter. Do you want it?
The 21st century.
Yeah, the 21st.
I think it should not be us to write the next book about this. Yeah, I think in a sense it is always important for another generation to have different perspective, and I think we are now too close to this. It's really a great question. Thank you so much. But I think we are now very curious what the reactions will be and what the discussion will be. We really hope that it will, and this is also how we end the introduction, that it will inspire new research of others. It's of course time is running. So for example, in this book, we thought we are really, as Hillel mentioned, really up to date, but it's already 1 year old, and and there are several events in the history of Jewish community in Prague, but also in Brno and Olomouc, where people ask me, so will that be already included? And I told them, sorry, that's already closed. So there are definitely more topics to discuss. But thank you. I think it's now the younger generation should write new books.
That's,
Is that it? Where's Pablo?
that was it, right?
Yeah.
So, or do you want to?
No. I thought that we were getting a signal.
Oh, we were getting to it. Great work. Yeah. Well, we can clap again, but let me thank all the contributors for being here, and thank you for all these questions. They were very thoughtful. Thank you. I know. Yeah.
Lots of other people.
Oh, he's the expert. Yeah.